afternoon to all the participants who are connecting to this webinar. I see the numbers getting up, so I'm just talking to tell you that yes, you are at the right spot. This is the webinar. This is the virtual room, the virtual conference room in which we will be discussing the current Indian situation and how it's, what are the perspectives for the future, for recovery, for exiting the crisis, and what that also can lead in terms of perspectives for environmental transition, climate protection, and biodiversity protection. So I'm, before really getting into the introduction, I'm still waiting for the different people to connect, and we will be really beginning the seminar in a few minutes from now. Yes, numbers are increasing. We are very happy to have a very important and I would say world-renowned speakers today, so that we have had a lot of registration. Still waiting 1 to 2 minutes before I'm really officially opening the webinar. Maybe one thing that I can say before really opening for those who are already there, in the audience, if you are with us through Zoom, you can use the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen to ask questions that I will then retransmit to the panelists at the time of questions. If you are on the YouTube channel, there is also a possibility for you to ask questions that the team will also transmit to me for me to be able to ask your questions to the panelists. So maybe I will be just opening the seminar while still new participants are still connecting. I'm Sébastien Treyer. I'm the Executive Director of IDRI, the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations, a think tank based at Sciences Po, Paris. And we are very happy today to have been able to organize a seminar dedicated to India and the current situation in India and the perspectives for sustainable development. We have three very important panelists to discuss this situation. And I will just say a few words of introduction of why we thought it is so important to have that conversation today with specialists of India, with people living in India, but also for the world, for other regions in the world to understand the situation and what's going to be, what could be the perspectives. Of course, all over the world, we put a lot of emphasis on the plans for exiting the crisis, in particular the recovery plans that are at the heart of the political discussions, for instance, in Europe. But we know also very well that there is a lot that we do not know about the next stages in the health crisis, the socioeconomic impacts of the lockdown, the magnitude of the economic recession, its nature, its unequal impacts, and the type of responses that is needed. So we are still in these very uncertain times where we don't know exactly what's going to happen, and at the same time we need to plan for the future, and that's a very, very crucial moment. And I think this is true for Europe, even if we citizens of Europe have the impression that the health crisis is over, it might come back, and that's very dangerous. But I think in India, this issue of having to plan while we don't know exactly what is the situation is I think very, very crucial. Both because the lockdown impact have been very important. We saw in the press seen from Europe the impact it had on migrant workers, for instance, but also because the health crisis is still ongoing at high levels in India. And so that's, we understand that this is a particularly uncertain time, but a particularly difficult time for India. And so that's why it's very important for us to understand and have an understanding from within what's happening. But on top of this, India is a key global player, economically important, politically important, and particularly for us at IDRI in terms of India's role in international climate and biodiversity action and governance. We know that the UN Secretary General has pushed for the idea that we need to build back better. And I think that's really true, because at IDRI we believe that putting Agenda 2030 and the climate and biodiversity objectives at the heart of reconstruction is particularly important, because that would be a way to tackle the root causes of inequality, of vulnerability, of risks. But still, that's, if this is a global language that we hear from the UN Secretary General, if it's also somewhere in the G20 commitments at the beginning of the crisis, for us at IDRI, it's very important to better understand what's happening in India, and also think about how we could really contribute to a diplomacy of reconstruction. I'm quoting Laurence Tubiana on that. She was telling in one of our former webinars, instead of having a diplomacy of climate and biodiversity, we need to think of the diplomacy of reconstruction and how we can be the diplomacy to build back better in very complicated geopolitical times. Between the three players that last year we planned that we would need to have China, India, and the European Union to commit for better, higher climate ambition ahead of the COP26 in Glasgow. That was supposed to happen at the end of this year. Now Glasgow is postponed to next year. We have EU-China summit postponed because of complications in the trade and investment negotiation and the political negotiation between the two big blocs. We have worrying events happening at the Chinese-Indian border. So we have to build that diplomacy of reconstruction while being aware of these very complicated geopolitical times. So this is the overall context. We want to understand India because India matters for so many reasons in the global capacity to push forward a sustainability-oriented reconstruction. But we know that, and we know that cooperation cannot happen without an understanding of the domestic policies. So I think what we had in mind is really to have this seminar to better understand and also think of solutions. Better understand means that we want to really have our panelists help us understand what are the vulnerabilities in India, what are the main factors of the economic but also the social crisis in India. The issue of jobs and informal workers or the informal part of the economy is something that we heard a lot, but we're really interested to have your understanding of that. We're of course also very interested to understand what are the perspectives for exiting the crisis in terms of rescue plans, stimulus package, and the capacity to invest. Are there debt issues, for instance, in India that might be constraining the capacity of the Indian government and the federated state governments to invest and help out of the crisis? And to what extent, if there is this capacity to build a stimulus package, how can we orient it towards sustainability? Is that a conversation that is ongoing? And we know that for lots of people in cities, we have seen that the vulnerability of what is at stake is actually the structural vulnerability of our economic and social systems in which cities play a key role. We understand that both in Europe and in India, having a clean air was suddenly something very striking in the middle of our terrible social and economic crisis. So we want also to see to what extent the structures of development, meaning for instance in cities or economic sectors, might be changing thanks to the crisis. So to deal with that, these are enormous questions, but we have very, very knowledgeable speakers. Of course, they will not cover all the answers to all my questions, but still we are very happy and honored to have Christophe Jaffrelot. Christophe is Research Director at CERI Sciences Po. CERI is the International Relations Research Center at Sciences Po. And Christophe is, for France, surely the expert of India. And I think also globally, one of the renowned experts of how can we make sense of the evolutions of what's happening in India. And thank you, Christophe, for having accepted. And I think you will help us a little bit understand what's the current situation in India. We're also very honored to have Ajay Mathur. Ajay, thank you very much for having accepted this invitation. It's a pleasure always for IDRI to be collaborating with such a bigger cousin as TERI. TERI, the Energy and Resource Institute in New Delhi, is much larger and really a more installed and very renowned think tank on sustainability issues and particularly energy transition in New Delhi. And I think we would be really interested, Ajay, if you could help us understand both what's to what extent the recovery might be converging with the ecological transition and climate transition objectives, and what that also says to the capacity of India to participate globally to this diplomacy of reconstruction. And we're also very happy and honored to have with us Vaidehi Tandel. Vaidehi is a researcher at the IDFC Institute, a think tank based in Mumbai. And Vaidehi is a specialist of urban planning and urban economics. And as we saw, the social, ecological, and economic problems that we are tackling are particularly acute. And I mean, in rural areas would be the same, but I think the structures of the urban systems are particularly at stake. And that's why I think it would be very important to have also this urban lens of analysis of the crisis and how we could come out of the crisis. So without further ado, just maybe two elements before I pass the floor to Christophe. What few elements of how this seminar is going to be organized. I'll pass the floor to the three speakers for 15 minutes each. I will try to wave at you or make use of my voice to try and stop you if you're much too long, but I believe it will be complicated because all of that you have to say is going to be very useful. I'll nevertheless tell you when it's over, when the time is up. And then we will have 30 minutes for an exchange with the audience. And for the audience, I say it again, the way to interact with our panelists is that you have on the bottom of your screen a question and answer box. And this question and answer box can be used for you to send questions that I will then retransmit. So your written questions will be clustered or reorganized by me to send questions to the panelists for the last half an hour. So this is basically how these things are going to be working. And I leave the floor directly to Christophe Jaffrelot. Christophe, merci beaucoup encore. It's your turn.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sébastien. I will immediately share my screen to show you my PowerPoint because 15 minutes will be certainly the minimum I will need for making the points I have prepared. And if you have any problem seeing it, you let me know. Otherwise, I will proceed. I will proceed.
It's okay.
That's very good. I will proceed by focusing on the economic dimension of this crisis. But as you said yourself, the economy is not in a vacuum, and we need to look first at the public health dimension of this crisis and at the social implications of this crisis. As a footnote, let me add that this is drawing from a long note, a brief I have just published with Institut Montaigne, From Slowdown to Lockdown, India's Economy and the COVID-19 Shock. That's something you will find easily on the web. So let me say a few words about the health issues to begin with. We have a real paradox in India with few cases. If we look at the ratio between the cases and population, the Indian population is so large that we can say that there are only something like 460,000 cases and less than 15,000 deaths in India today. These are the figures released yesterday. They keep changing every day, of course. That's not much, but the big but is that the number of daily cases is not decreasing. The curve has not been flattened. In fact, yesterday, Le Monde, the French newspaper, published a very interesting graph comparing India, China, Pakistan, and Russia. And you see that India, in spite of the lockdown, has not flattened the curve. In fact, we do have more than 10,000 cases, additional cases every day in India today. So this is the first caveat qualifying the idea that the pandemic is not so important. The other caveat is, of course, that even if there are few cases in comparison to the population, there are too many cases in comparison to the situation of the health situation. I mean, the public health system in India has only 700,000 hospital beds, which means only 0.7 per 1,000 people, compared to almost each and every country, emerging countries as well as developed countries. It's little. And it's even worse if you turn to the ICU beds, because there you have only 10% of these beds which are equipped with ventilators or the usual ICU equipment. Why that? Because India has never invested much in public health. Only 1.2% of the government expenditures of the budget were devoted to the public health. And I'm sure there'll be a debate now in India because this is certainly a problem. Well, the health issues have been somewhat taken a back seat over the last few weeks because the main issue was in the street, was on the road. The lockdown decided in March resulted in a major social crisis, because when factories, shops, markets were shut down, transport services discontinued, and most of the supply chains broken, migrant workers, millions of migrant workers, having lost their job, had no other solution but to go back to the village. And the estimate that the CMIE made said something like 122 million people have lost their job only in April, including, of course, you can say daily laborers from the informal sector. The informal sector represents something like 80% of the Indian economy, so they were the first badly affected by that. CMIE, Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, gave also unemployment rates which showed how big the shock was, jumping the joblessness from 8 to 25% in a few weeks. And of course, this is not so reliable because to measure unemployment in India is quite a task. What I want to make as a point on this social aspect is this crisis made visible something that was somewhat concealed, but very much the reflection of the growth pattern of India. India had a very great growth rates for decades, but at the expense of equalities. More growth meant more inequalities. And these graphs show that. I don't need to elaborate on the graphs. That became visible all of a sudden when the migrant workers were on the road. But I will repeat that many times. This COVID crisis makes visible what was latent, what was not so obvious, and it's true everywhere, and it's true in every respect. If we had the time, we would speak about politics, we would speak about the relations between communities. This is a moment when things which are there but not necessarily visible become very much obvious. What is for me a key element there is, of course, in terms of what it is revealing. It is revealing the very bad situation of the Indian agriculture. 55% of the workforce, 15% of the GDP, and that's why you have so many migrant workers. This is because the percentage of rural Indians living below the poverty line has increased for the first time in the history of independent India, which is, again, for me, I repeat, a revelation, something the COVID crisis made visible, but that was there before. That was there before 2020. The crisis was a very rude shock. What has been the response of the government? Well, you've had two relief packages. The first one represented something like 1% of the Indian GDP. It was announced by Narendra Modi on March 27, and it was at that time much less than what other countries were doing. Narendra Modi announced a second relief plan on May 12 and said that this time it was 20 lakh crore large, representing therefore 10% of India's GDP. The problem is that there is a debate on this relief plan, and I'm sure we'll return to that in the discussion in the Q&A, because these 10%, so-called 10% of the GDP plan included first the first relief package, and more importantly, the huge infusions of liquidity by the RBI, something like 8 trillion rupees that had already taken place in April. And last but not least, most of the package consisted in loans, in particular to SMEs. So when the experts, the banks, the Deutsche Banks, UBS, whatever, had to assess the actual level of the second relief package, they came up to the conclusion that it represented only, again, 1% of the GDP. The problem with the loans, the fact that loans are key to this second relief package, is that the banks don't lend money, especially to MSMEs, micro, small, and medium enterprises. And they don't do that because they have a very huge, very big problem with non-performing assets. The non-performing assets, after years of mismanagement of the public banks, have reached something like 10% of the gross advances, which means that the banks are not lending money to the MSMEs, but parking their money with the RBI. By the way, this is also one of the reasons why the investment rate in India has declined so steadily over the last few years. You don't lend money, and therefore you do not allow investment to take place when you have these kind of NPAs. Why can't the government spend more? Why only 2% of the GDP if we put the two relief packages together? Well, the main reason is that before the lockdown disrupted the economy, you've had years of slowdown. And the slowdown started in the fiscal year 2016-2017, very soon after the demonetization of November 2016. And it was a steady decline, cutting by almost 50% the growth rate in something like 3 fiscal years. So India in February 2020, 1 month before the lockdown, was already in a bad shape. And that became very clear during the budget session when the government started to think about privatization. I will return to that. So with this slowdown, the fiscal deficit remained very high. It was almost 9% in 2018. It has probably now crossed over 12%, because if you want to have the full picture, you have to look at not only the central government, but of course the state government's fiscal deficits. So these are the reasons why the relief packages could not be more significant. With such a small relief coming from the center and from the states, the prospect is very grim. In fact, when we look at the, you can say, prognosis that the experts are doing, Goldman Sachs says the fiscal year should see a contraction of the growth rate by 5%. The State Bank of India says 6.8%. This is unprecedented. This is a recession India has never experienced, as Goldman Sachs says. And of course, that has repercussions on the rating. India's sovereign ratings are lowered one after the other by one agency after the other. Moody did it in May from stable to negative, and Fitch Ratings did the same this month. The social impact, of course, also is assessed by the expert agencies. And for instance, Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative said that most probably in the coming years, India will see millions of people pushed back into poverty. India had reduced the poverty rate over the last few years. We will see something completely unprecedented in the history of the country and maybe of the world. We will see millions of people returning to poverty in the coming years. That's what they say. In this context, the government of India, as well as some state governments, are fighting the COVID crisis by making structural reforms. It's a very interesting strategy. Instead of having the usual tactical package by just spending more, India, instead of spending more, is changing the structure of its economy to some extent. And that's something that was reflected in the speech Narendra Modi made on the 12th of May, when he said, this is the right time to become self-reliant. Well, you do not become self-reliant overnight. This is a structural plan. This is a long-term plan. So, for instance, it means more protectionism. India was already following a more protectionist policy for a couple of years, but it also means that you protect your industry from investments, from foreign investments. And in April, the Indian Department for Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade had revised already its foreign investment policy, making prior approval of the government mandatory for investment activities, including mergers and acquisitions, from countries that share a border with India. What is the country that shares border with India and is in a position to invest massively in India? China, of course. So China was kept at arm's length already in the name of self-reliance. At the same time, of course, the Make in India program is continuing, and India is trying hard to attract foreign investors. Hopefully, those who are leaving China and are looking for greener pastures, the Indian government has announced that it has reserved for them land twice the size of Luxembourg. So self-sufficiency is something you need to clarify. I mean, at least it's not evident that it means more than anti-China policies. I mean, China containment, the other investors are more than welcome. The second very important decision that was made, that was announced along with the second relief package by the finance minister, was more privatization. Privatizations were in the pipeline already. The budget, the 2020-2021 budget in February had a full paragraph on privatization. Air India was supposed to be privatized already. The life insurance company, a huge public undertaking of 1 million agents, was also supposed to welcome private investors. But the deepening of the fiscal deficit in the context of the COVID crisis has accelerated the privatization plans of the Indian government. So a new public sector enterprises policy has been announced, And the finance minister has announced that a list of strategic sectors will be notified where there will be no more than 4 public sector enterprises. It's a very important structural decision that will probably help the big players, the big private companies to grow even more. The private companies which are in a position financially as well as politically to buy big public undertakings in petroleum products or in the banking sector are a handful of Indian capitalists who are already at the helm of what I call oligopolies. You know, they are oligopolistic. And this graph, The Economist published recently, is very interesting. It shows that already only 20 Indian companies account for nearly 70% of India Inc.'s total earnings, and they were only 14% 3 decades ago, which shows that India was already on its way to become more oligopolistic. The privatization plans may accelerate this trend. Third, agriculture. Agriculture has to be liberalized according to the government of India. And the Modi government intends in particular to amend the Agricultural Produce Marketing Committee Act that should deregulate trading practices in the agricultural markets. Peasants also would be allowed to sell their product, therefore, where it is valuable for them. Barriers to interstate trade would be lifted, and contract farming would be introduced in such a way that the buyer can assure a price to the farmer at the time of sowing. This is described by the supporters of this reform as the 1991 moment for agriculture. 1991 was the moment when India liberalized its industry and its services. So now it is the turn of the agriculture. Last but not least, reforming the labor laws at the state level in that case has been also the order of the day in many states of India, BJP ruled states, Uttar Pradesh, Gujarat, Karnataka, Madhya Pradesh, which have all passed ordinances exempting the industrialist from most of the labor laws. Uttar Pradesh is a case in point. The ordinance is called temporary exemption from certain labor laws ordinance. In fact, the number of labor laws that I have listed there is very large. What is the objective? The objective is to again make India more attractive to foreign investors because very often the labor laws are seen as responsible for the lack of attractivity of India. Interestingly, the trade union organically linked to the BJP, the Bharatiya Mazdoor Sangh, protested that such moves were rare, even in most undemocratic countries, and said that if these decisions were implemented, there would be no other way out except going for agitation. So we will see whether they really implement these ordinances, the state governments, and whether the unions indeed are on the warpath. Well, my point to conclude, the point I would like to make in my conclusion is certainly in the long term, the structural reforms may improve the situation of India. But as Mr. Keynes said, we'll all be dead in the long term if nothing is done on time before. And I think that certainly these structural reforms are important, but they may not be sufficient in the short term and in the midterm, in the medium term. So if India wants to relaunch the economy, the recovery plans will imply more spendings, more public spendings. To spend more, India will have to use its huge foreign exchange reserves and or borrow from money from foreign lenders. And that's not impossible. It you see that the India's debt to GDP ratio is not great, but is not alarming either. So I expect from India both things: more spendings using the foreign exchange reserves, and more loans asked to well, private banks, financial markets, as well as World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and that has started already. But that's, I think, the only way out in the short run, and hopefully it will be sufficient. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Christophe. That was very informative and a very nice framework also for the further discussion. Ajay, from your side at Terry, how do you see the perspectives, and can you make the link also with the issue of making the future more sustainable? You need to unmute your microphone, Ajay. We can't hear you.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. First of all, it's great to follow Christophe, because I think he has focused on a set of activities which would help us focus on the key challenges, obviously the key problems, and therefore the way I would look at it, what are the kinds of opportunities that this situation provides in order to move ahead towards a greener future. It's quite possible, as Christophe said, that without large-scale structural reforms, it may not be possible for India to move ahead. But with reforms, we can. And what I'd like to do is to give a flavor of the kinds of reforms, of the kinds of actions that would help us move towards a greener future. So the first point that I want to make is to echo what Christophe said. The amount of cash support that is being provided as part of the relief packages is very small. As Christophe mentioned, it's about 1% of the GDP. In hard cash, it becomes about $30 billion. But that, for the reasons that he said, given that the fiscal space is very, very small in India, that's the total amount of cash that is available. The second and the third parts, which add up to that large number which Christophe mentioned, is largely around the liquidity that is put in, the credit guarantees that are provided, and the banks being asked to provide greater credit in particular areas. MSME, the small and medium enterprises, is one, agriculture is another. The power sector, you could say, is also one of them. But these are the kinds of areas which have been directed, to which the banks have been directed to provide resources. However, I would like to point out that, and again, this, I think Christophe showed it extremely well, that generally speaking, banks are extremely cautious in lending. The investment rate has been coming down primarily because of the non-performing assets. It is here, I believe, that green projects have an opportunity. They have an opportunity because over the years, the green projects have had a much lower rate of non-performing assets than non-green. Now, obviously, this is a very small sample. The non-green portfolio is a much larger portfolio. But I think it attests to the fact also that the longer term sustainability is better with green projects. And today, whether it is India or any other jurisdiction, the focus is on jobs. The focus is on sustainable livelihoods, jobs that are not only there for today, but there for a long time, and on economic growth. So those three things, jobs, sustainable livelihoods, and economic growth, are the mantras for the days as we move ahead. And my suggestion is that green growth is the only way that you can meet all these three requirements. So let us take some examples. Where is it that this green growth is possible? Very clearly, given the way in which COVID has happened, given the fact that crowding is one of the easiest ways for transmission to occur, it is very clear that the slums of today are one of the reasons for fearing fast transmission. You remember one of the first graphs that Christoph showed, that in India, the rate is still increasing. In other words, growth in affordable housing is going to be a big investment area. And as you go into investment in affordable housing, investment in sustainable affordable housing, energy efficient affordable housing is important. This is because what we have noticed in the past is that affordable housing is built as cinder blocks, where energy efficiency is very low. To be comfortable, then people have to put in a lot of mechanical devices. They start off with fans, and as their incomes increase over a period of time, they move into more and more energy consuming devices, whether it is desert coolers or later to air conditioners. Consequently, making the buildings such that they are energy efficient and well ventilated to start with. Defining that the number of hours of discomfort is minimized in their design becomes the most important issue, because then their hours of discomfort are maximized, the hours of discomfort are minimized. They are minimized further if the person puts on a desert cooler. They are minimized further if you put in an air conditioner. But an energy efficient building with insulation and with ventilation together help us move in that direction. In other words, affordable housing, green affordable housing is one of the ways which is where there is a huge opportunity, both from addressing COVID as well as from addressing green issues. Similarly, transport. Transport is something on which I think whether behavioral change will happen or not is yet to come in. What we have seen from a number of European cities is, even though the traffic is not yet at the same stage as it was in the pre-lockdown period, we are seeing nitrogen oxide levels which exceed those of the pre-lockdown periods. It seems this is because people are moving from public transport to private transport, again, for the fear of transmission in public places. I just hope that this doesn't become one of the behavioral changes that occurs because of the COVID virus. It's one of the behavioral changes we do not want. But what it tells us is that an emphasis on sustainable transport is important. And consequently, whether it is buses that run on electricity or two-wheelers that run on electricity or trucks that run on hydrogen, all of these become important in the years ahead. What I would suggest is that whether it is cooling, we talked of this as affordable housing, whether it is batteries, if you talk of large electricity infrastructures, we are already at a time when solar electricity is the cheapest electricity in India, but when the sun is shining. If we have to make it the cheapest electricity at night also, replace coal as cheapest electricity at night, we will need batteries. Now, price discovery through tenders has found that in 3 years, we'll have round-the-clock electricity based on solar plus batteries, which will be cheaper than coal. In other words, there is a large market for batteries. Similarly, I talked about hydrogen, whether it is long-distance transport, whether it is high temperatures in industry instead of using fossil fuels. Those are areas where green has a potential. Green also has a potential because it means that import dependency would reduce. Today, India imports something like 80% of the petroleum and about 20% of the coal that it uses. Reducing import dependency is very, very important. And especially in a day and age where the amount of cash that is available for paying for imports is becoming dramatically reduced, that becomes even more important. So I would think that in the days to come, we will see as this particular slide, which I hope you will take as a takeaway, slow shows credit would be available, but what about equity? So there's an opportunity to provide international funding, whether from the multilateral banks or from pension funds or from other national development banks, particularly focused on equity in the green agenda, whether it's affordable housing, whether it's schooling, whether it is hydrogen, whether it's batteries. In all of those things, if there's equity available, credit will follow. Locally available credit will follow. Consequently, my second set of takeaways is around the fact that we expect green sectors to grow because there is a great growth potential, as well as because there is a greater viability and ability to repay loans. Batteries, cooling are areas in which we may see a lot more investment. And this would be helped with innovative financing so that credit availability and particularly equity availability in green projects occurs, and then it draws the local debt which is available through the kinds of actions that have been done. How does this influence the international agenda? Now, one of the things that I would like to bring to the table is that at Paris in 2015, India had put forward its nationally determined contributions, the NDC, and that NDC looked at many things, but amongst the things it looked at was reducing the carbon intensity of its economy by 33 to 35% less in 2030 compared to 2005. It also said that 40% of our electricity generation capacity would be based on renewables. Now, there is a very, very good possibility that we may meet these goals in 2022 or 2023 or 2024. Very, very good possibility despite the COVID interventions. The COVID interventions may push it back by a year. Now, even at the time when these NDCs were put, India was the only G20 country, and I emphasize only G20 country, whose NDC put it on a target to meet the global 2 degrees centigrade goal. Only. Not the 1.5. But if the world has to move towards a 2 degrees centigrade goal, the only country, only G20 country whose NDC committed it in that quantified direction was that of India. Now, one of the key challenges, therefore, is why, India asks, why is it so important to enhance this? We will meet this, but other countries have to step to the plate. Other countries also have to have NDCs which put them at least on the 2 degree path, if not the 1.5 degree path. And consequently, there is this political tangle which is occurring. Now, if India meets its current NDC goals in 2022, 2023, 2024, clearly by 2030, they would have done more. Will they commit to it is a separate issue. That's the political tangle that I was talking about. So let us spend a few minutes on what is it that can be done through the global processes, through the multilateral and bilateral processes to help us move India faster towards reducing its carbon emissions. Now, clearly one of the things that India has going for it, both good and bad, is that the levels of consumption in India are still very low. The average level of consumption of energy in India is approximately something of the order of 0.6 tons of oil equivalent per person per year, something of that sort. Consumption, not supply. As opposed to that, the minimum amount that a country, that a developed country, that a OECD country, which is a highly developed, Japan and Korea, they have about 4 tons of oil equivalent worth of energy per person per year. 0.6 and 4. All other countries who are developed, who are industrialized, have energy consumption which is more than 4. So in other words, there is a lot of energy demand that needs to be supplied in order for people to have a better quality of life, whether in terms of livelihoods, whether in terms of production opportunities, whether in terms of mobility opportunities. The challenge is we may have to meet these energy goals without increasing carbon dioxide. How does that happen? Technology is the answer. We talked of some technologies a moment ago. We talked of batteries, we talked of cooling, we talked of hydrogen, and so on. Now, if technologies are important, then I think what is important is that there is a quick transfer of these technologies so that they can be adopted in India and in other developing countries. So globally, the debate around acceleration of the transfer of cutting-edge technologies becomes important, as does issues related to their financing. In France, the average return that is available on investment is something of the order of, oh, well, at best about 2%. Now, in India, it can be higher. But the problem is that the foreign exchange currency rate between the euro on the one side and the rupee on the other side depreciates. And therefore, if there has to be a high return for euro money that is invested in India in green opportunities, we need to have the financial mechanisms which allow hedging to occur. Today's hedging is largely around commercial trading. It's around a 3-year tenor, not around the 10-year tenors in which we are talking about influencing the manufacturing, influencing the adoption of the technologies that we are talking about. So what I'd like to leave you with is the fact that whether it is finance or whether it is technology, we need to have a global discussion on how to accelerate it. The COPs have become the places where the long-term targets are decided. We need to have discussions there on the technologies, on the financial instruments that can make this happen, that can help the acceleration happen. Unfortunately, they don't happen there. They happen in other fora. We need to ensure that this COPs, the Conference of the Parties of the Climate Change Negotiations, is where this happens. There are other places where this could happen. The G20, for example, joint actions by G20 countries. France took the leadership in bringing together the cooling coalition, brought in Rwanda, since the Kigali Amendment to enhance the phase out of greenhouse gases in cooling was brought in there, brought in India as a leader in reducing cooling demand. So I think there is, they came into the G7 meeting that President Macron did in Biarritz last year. So I think there is a possibility to expand it to the G20 so that there is common action. There's harmonization of timing in actions that those countries take. Those would help in accelerating it, because the global technology suppliers would get the signal that across a range of countries, across a range of large countries, we are seeing a demand for these newer and more efficient technologies. The last point that I'd like to leave you with is around track 2 processes. There is no doubt that at the multilateral level, there is a lot of action that can be done. But at the end of the day, what say the EU and India, what they do together matters. The kinds of thinking on competitive action, how do we source these technologies and source them competitively for both the geographies? How do we develop the synergy with COVID responses? All of these are things that can grow with the track 2 processes. So I'd like to end with the 3 takeaways on actions that are needed at the level of the Conference of the Parties, and the actions that are needed at the G7 and G20 processes, and actions that are needed at track 2 processes. And particularly, I want to focus on an India-EU track 2 process on climate, which I think is urgently needed. Thank you very much, Sebastian. I am extremely grateful for this opportunity, and I look forward both to the future presentations as well as to the questions and answers. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Ajay. That was very, very impressive, from both the national situation to the global discussions. And of course, at IDRI, we're very happy that we have that partnership with Terry to be able to bring our building blocks to this track 2 conversation. Track 2 meaning, for those who are not familiar, if I'm not mistaken, the idea that we need expert discussions parallel to the diplomatic discussions in order to push forward the political agenda. That's what you meant. I'm glad I understood that well. Vaidehi, thank you for waiting, but I didn't want to stop the 2 former speakers. It's now your turn to give us an insight in your urban perspective about all these questions. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope you can see my screen. Okay,
yes, we can.
Great. Yeah, okay. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. It was great to listen in to the other presentations as well. And I also learned some new things. So thank you for this. So we know that cities in most countries across the world have been badly hit by the COVID pandemic, and India is no different. The one difference, though, is that Indian cities have been poorly managed and been neglected from a policy focus for the past several years. And this has resulted in a whole number of inefficient outcomes in the form of the number of slum households within cities, in the form of extremely high air pollution, and also in general a lack of access to amenities, a lack of access to public open spaces. And all of these together, I'm of the opinion, have exacerbated the impact of this pandemic that has swept through the megacities of the country. So so here are 2 maps of India. On the right is the map of the biggest urban settlements in the country. So the size of the red circles here will tell you what's the size of the city. And on the right are the map with the blue circle showing you the number of cases. And you can see a very tight correlation between where the mega cities are and where the COVID cases and the outbreaks are the biggest. Until yesterday, Mumbai had the largest number of cases in the country, and I think as of today, Delhi has sort of overtaken the city to be the unfortunate capital of COVID in India. So these. In a sense, it's understandable why the major outbreaks are happening in mega cities, and the theory behind this largely is because these cities are extremely dense, and the way urban citizens live and move across, and the nature of contact between hundreds of people every day as they commute to their work or they attend any social functions during the course of their daily lives, is bound to lead to create conditions for a rapid spread of the disease. But what's sort of being not as well understood and just coming to light is that it's not just density alone, but it's also various socio-economic factors that are contributing to the prevalence of diseases. So the disease seems to be spreading very unevenly within cities themselves. It doesn't only like focus on urban and rural area, urban and poor, the rich and poor areas within the cities equally, but seems to be affecting the poorer parts more. So this is just a table that I wanted to put out there. This was a study that my colleagues and I did in Mumbai as the cases were coming up. We started tracking the spatial spread of the disease by looking at where the containment zones were being created. Containment zones was is sort of a policy tool where if there is a COVID case in any society, then the authorities cordon off that area and declare it a containment zone. This could be a building, it could be an area of a certain perimeter and so on. So these occur. So when the outbreaks are large, the municipal corporation categorized the containment zones as orange and red containment zones. And we found, as we were tracking these containment zones when they were coming up every week or so, we found that about 57% of the containment zones were coming up in the slum areas of Mumbai, which have 42% of the population of the city. And not just that, I mean, recent analysis has also brought to light the fact that the disease seems to be more severe in these areas. So if you look at the case fatality rates, they are higher in slums as compared to other parts of the city. So this tells you that there is, there are reasons for this. The one being that these areas are extremely overcrowded. You cannot maintain social distancing in a small tenement with like 5 people living in one room. It's impossible to get access to adequate water in order to maintain hand hygiene. You're also sort of using common facilities like common toilets and common public taps. All of this makes slums and slum dwellers more vulnerable to outbreaks. You also know that for those living in slums, they tend to have a number of underlying health conditions as well, which also makes them more vulnerable. The other vulnerable population, and this Christoph sort of highlighted in his presentation, was the migrants within cities. These are according to the economic survey of 2016-17, these are about 9 million in number. They're not permanent migrants. They're migrants who come into cities for a certain part of the year in order to get work, but their permanent base is in their rural villages. And this map here shows you the migrant routes that the economic survey put out. And you can see that the densest migrant routes, or the thickest migrant routes, are the ones that are going into the megacities of the country, where currently you have a very large COVID outbreak. So these migrants have faced two consequences of COVID. The first, of course, is the disease consequence, where a lot of them have been infected. So now that the lockdown is sort of lifted and migrants have been able to return home, when the governments in their home states are testing the migrants that are coming, they're finding a very high prevalence of COVID in migrants who have come back from cities like Mumbai, Ahmedabad, Delhi, as compared to other cities in the country. So that's one major issue. And the other major issue is the loss of livelihoods. Because of the lockdown that was announced by the government and the subsequent shutdown of all economic activity, the migrants who were daily wage workers have found themselves without livelihoods, without incomes, and really without any safety nets. And they've sort of made the difficult decision to go back. And this leaves a huge question mark about what happens when the cities resume. Will they return? Do they want to return? What happens to their safety, going forward, if there, whether there will be some policy measures that will be taken to take into account their difficulties. The other sort of fragility, or the other consequence of pandemics is, of course, it has highlighted a number of failures, policy failures, and it's really brought some things starkly to light. The first is the very fact that urban areas do not have the necessary social safety nets. So India has a large number of welfare schemes. They have a very robust rural employment guarantee scheme uh, for the rural poor. Other welfare schemes are also normally targeted to the poor, but they mostly work well in rural areas where it is easy to find and target the rural poor. There is no equivalent employment guarantee scheme in urban areas. There is no social safety net for the urban poor. The second issue is that most of your benefits are tied to your domicile or where you come from, which means that you cannot access the benefits. So if you are a migrant from, say, Bihar in Maharashtra, you cannot access the benefits in Maharashtra. And you cannot access the public distribution system, which is the system by which food, grains, and other essentials are distributed to the lower income groups and the vulnerable groups at subsidized prices. So migrants have been unable to access these even though there has been policy announcements saying that PDS will be ramped up and there will be a lot more grains and so on provided to the poor. They've not really been able to access this. So that's the critical failure that has come to light. The second failure is that of urban planning. The way city governments and city planners have looked at urban planning is through a lens of regulation and regulating how much can be built within cities. So the dominant fear, of course, is that Indian cities are too dense, and therefore the response of planners has been to put in place a lot of regulations that would make it difficult to build, and thus adding to the cost of construction, adding to and resulting in a lack of affordability. So what this also means that just because there is a restriction on how you can build, it has not stopped people from coming in to access job opportunities. And without access to affordable housing in the formal sector, these workers and these households have turned to slums as the solution to their accommodation. And that's sort of what's led to a proliferation of slums, while the entire regulatory process on what you can build and how much you can construct is, sort of failed to meet its objective of controlling densities. It has in fact led to a perverse outcome of overcrowding, right? So in a city like Mumbai, the per capita availability of residential space is about 14 square meters, which is extremely small, and it's almost inhuman to expect people to live in extremely overcrowded conditions. And that's the outcome of the extremely Byzantine regulatory regime within Indian municipal corporations. The third failure is that of public health, and of course, our healthcare systems are much better in the cities as compared to rural areas. There's also access to bigger hospitals and larger and more number of healthcare professionals. But at the same time, in a pandemic like this, these get strained, and these have been strained in cities across the world. So it's not really, Indian cities have not been an exception in that sense. But what has really been something that has contributed to the worsening outcomes has been the fact that that Indian citizens do not have enough per capita public open space that is available. The quality of air is extremely poor. Indian cities almost always top the charts in any sort of ranking of the world's most polluted cities, which means that a large number of them are already having respiratory illnesses and respiratory problems. These major public health issues are something that that I feel has sort of resulted in say higher fatalities and sort of greater hospitalizations, because India otherwise has a very young population, so one should not have seen, so the age adjusted fatality rate actually should be quite low in Indian cities, but that's not happening. So if I can just spend like a couple of minutes to think and talk about the reforms that are likely to happen or that are already underway. The first reform to address this is, of course, restructuring the social protection architecture. There's already been, good minds who are talking about it, experts who are sort of thinking through how you can re-architect the social protection regime in the country. Can you de-link, the benefits of, can you de-link people from their domicile in order to avail benefits? How can you identify urban poor? How can you identify migrants? Will a social benefits registry work? All of these efforts have already been underway. But the other two problems, there's that sort of come to light was, of course, we know slum dwellers were at risk, and the kind of policy reforms that are needed to address this issue, it's not clear what this is going to look like. My sense is that most policymakers are going to demand a resettlement of the slums, where they're going to just ask slum dwellers to move out of the city into the suburban and far suburban areas, into sort of buildings in affordable housing sort of developments. And that's historically not worked in the past, because the reason why the poor live in cities is to be able to access job opportunities. It's because they cannot afford to spend the time and money to commute long distances. So asking them to go away and then expecting them to continue to have good access to job opportunities is tricky, and we are likely to see them come back. What could be a more interesting an innovative solution would be to think about redevelopment, think about granting some sort of land tenure, some recognition of the rights of the slum dwellers, so that they can maybe come together and improve their housing conditions and be able to legitimately access municipal services, and instead of getting them through other sort of informal ways. The third thing is about, it's a sort of a big picture question, and this is a little concerning, because we are seeing from some policy quarters some people saying that this entire idea of Indian urbanization is we don't need Indian cities. We should focus on rural areas, because rural areas have always been our strength, and the farmer has always been an important figure in Indian politics. So the question, so the policymakers are questioning, in fact, about the need for cities, and said that maybe, okay, now that these migrants have gone back to the rural areas, let's just give them the infrastructure in there and let them stay where they are, and let's focus on developing rural areas. To be clear, some sort of a rebalance after this is going to happen, because the sheer sizes of Indian megacities means that the disagglomeration effects outweigh the benefits of densities. So there will be some sort of a restructuring, and people will move out of the cities, but they may move to smaller cities and not necessarily other villages. And when that sort of a rebalancing happens, what you really need is policies that strengthen decentralization, which means policies that make sure that the smaller urban local bodies are able to effectively provide local municipal services. They have the necessary revenues, they have the necessary political powers to be able to serve the population that's going to grow in the coming future. So with that, I'll end, and thank you once again for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Vatahi. That was very important to also have that vision. So we have now a quarter of an hour to both enable you to discuss with one another, because some of the things that you've said are raising points of interesting questions. But I just want to raise some of the questions from the question and answer box that you might want to pick up. So for the sake of time, I will try to gather them. if you can just take notes of the ones that are of interest to you. There are, I think, at least two first set of questions on understanding the situation, and two sets about what should we do. The first set on understanding, there are some questions about why, despite the lockdown, the curve has not flattened on the COVID number of cases. So do we have any understanding of why, despite the strict lockdown, this has not functioned? And where are we now? So this is really just descriptive, but what is the situation now in terms of lockdown? The second question of clarification and understanding is a little bit more political already. It's about the role of local governments. If we follow through what Christophe Jaffrelot has been saying, we have national governments that are not, I mean, my understanding at least, and that was the understanding of the person asking the question, is that the national government was not necessarily delivering for now all what is needed for local citizens. And on top of, so the federated states governments might be facing a lot of political unrest, and how do they react to that? What is their capacity to find solutions if the lockdown is not functioning and if the social aid is not at the scale of what is needed? What is the situation for local governments, and how would you assess beyond what you've been saying on the BJP specific governments on the labor regulations? What is their political capacity to do something? That was on the understanding part, and please pick up the ones you want. On the solution side, I would say I heard questions about the fact that it's a lot about the financial instruments to some extent. The questions were on were the loans given to industries and SMEs, did they have any conditionality for being in the green direction? Ajay told us to what extent there is a lot of that the green solutions are meaningful if you want to reach all the criteria that we need to tick now if we want to be sustainable, resilient, etc. But was there any conditionality to that? And there was a question about what are the types of instruments that we could use in that regard. I think equity, Ajay mentioned particularly equity, etc. But maybe I think there is a discussion to be had between Christophe and Ajay, and of course Vaidehi, if you want, on who do we target and with which instruments? Because to some extent it was not completely clear if the right segments that need help are really targeted with the instruments that are developed, and what should be done more. And the last part about solutions is of course international. You all said we need to make much better use of the capacity of the national government to use debt, to get loans. How could we use more bilateral financial transfers? There is a question about the way the funds by AFD, the French Agency for Development, how they have been used, and should those types of grants or loans from bilateral aid be used more? And the last question that I see that might be important is, I think, Ajay, you said technologies are the solution. That does not mean that you are a techno-optimist. At least that's not how I know you. It's rather that you say, on green technologies, you have technologies and a market and a social use that is promising. But so maybe you want to add a point on what you are asking for is more tech transfer, not saying that there are technology fixes, but that there is a green sector in that. So because we don't have much time, I see that we have at least a few other questions, but at least maybe I would like you to have some first round of answers on the questions you want, and don't hesitate to also intervene with respect to what you have heard from the others. Christophe, maybe I let you go first.
Well, I'll be quick indeed because we have 10 minutes left. On the lockdown, it has been a very selective lockdown, and for the reason Vaidehi highlighted. How do you impose lockdown in slums? You know, it had to be different. And in fact, if we think about it, we wonder whether it was worth doing it, because you destroy the economy and you don't win much on the health side. So it's too late, it's done, but the damage might have been less. Why should India do like the Western countries? This is the question I have at the back of my mind. And in fact, it's a reflection of some emulation tactics or strategy. The states are different. And, you know, it's why it means a lot to look at local issues like my colleagues have done, because first, states do not communicate the same way. Mumbai is very transparent. Delhi is very opaque. Telangana has not given figures for days. Some states do test, others don't. And the more you test, of course, the more cases you have. So that's the first difference, big difference. How much information do you give? And secondly, of course, the other big difference is the response has been more or less effective. It's not necessarily because you put a lot of money. It's also because the government's style makes a difference. Kerala is very decentralized. There is a long tradition of taking initiative in health sectors at the local level. It's one of the reasons why it was so successful in flattening the curve. The only state that flattened the curve before the US itself was Kerala. There is a model there, and it's not only because of money. It's not only because of the investments. It's also because of the governments, the style of governance. On the conditionality, MSMEs are supposed to follow. There was a very interesting article recently in the Indian Express, and I can't do more, but read what it said. It's June 22. The scheme, the second relief package, excludes first-time borrowers and those whose accounts have turned bad. A separate scheme for stressed MSMEs is yet to be operationalized. Now, this is a citation that speaks, that says a lot. For the moment, we don't have a universal support system. The loans are for only a small group, in fact, of MSMEs. And also, in terms of interest rates, the RBI, I quote, may have cut repo rate to 4%, but credit to MSMEs is still going out at 8 to 14%. Well, that's a big difference, the interest rate. So you have conditionalities. You need to be already in bed with some bank, and you need to have good accounts. But when you get money, the rate is so high that in fact you hesitate to borrow money from the banks. That's not a relief. This is not a relief package the way it should be if MSMEs have to get some priority. And this is the big question. Are MSMEs on the top of the agenda of the Indian government? I think asking the question is getting the answer.
Thank you, Christophe. I was thinking of passing the floor now to Vaidehi and Ajay last. Is that okay for you? Vaidehi, are you okay for that? I think I just wanted to direct you a last question that appeared in the chat that was about how do we, what are the policies and land regulation that need to be considered if we want to accelerate economic recovery? So maybe that's something that you also might want to develop a little bit from your talk.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of decentralization, I'd just also like to add that Indian cities are also not uniform, just as states are not uniform. So even within Maharashtra, you have extremely rich and powerful corporations like Mumbai, and you have very small municipal councils within the metropolitan region who are completely dependent on grants from the center and have no sort of revenue collecting powers of their own. There's tremendous difference in the capacities of them to be able to cope. So the fear was, even if it's a city like Mumbai, if, there's some hope, some sort of internal capacity exists, but it totally does not exist for many of them. And now what we're seeing is while Mumbai has managed to flatten, in fact, Dharavi has been able to flatten the curve. We've seen less than 10 cases. Dharavi is the largest slum in Asia. It's located in Mumbai. We seem to flatten the curve in like very, very dense areas like Dharavi. But the cases are now going up in the smaller municipal areas within the metropolitan region. And that's the fear, is that there is really no capacity. It's the state that has to step in and just drive all the effort, as compared to say a Kerala, which has focused on local bodies and has been able to get that process of decentralization right, and that sort of is driving, I think, the results that we see in terms of the differences in the success or failures in being able to cope. On your point about land regulations, well, there are several. It's very hard to build. You would need to. There are blanket limits on floor space indices across cities. So in Mumbai, you cannot build. Officially, you cannot build above 1 and 1.33 FSI. If you need to build more, you need to buy the FSI from the corporation. If you need to have a long process of getting various permission processes, for which it takes time, it takes money, and you need to also then pay very high stamp duties on buying and selling of flats. So the entire process is extremely costly. So in terms of the regulations that can be fixed, we've worked on a housing report where we said that you need to really fix your permission process. You need to streamline it and make it timely. You need to fix your courts, because a large number of litigation buildings go into litigation, and the courts take so long for them to decide on these matters that it just leads to more delays and further stalling of construction projects. And to some extent, there is now a real estate regulatory authority, and that's hopefully going to solve the problem. But the authority can do nothing about the fact that the corporation is not giving permissions on time. That's not in their jurisdiction. They will just go after the developers and say, you've not built on time. So there's a whole lot of places. Certainly, stamp duties can also be reduced. And you can also, because across the world in other cities, the stamp duty rates are very low. It's about 1%, and in Indian cities it goes up to 3%, which is fairly high. So you're paying very high tax when you're buying property in the city. So those were my sort of quick suggestions in terms of.
Thank you very much, Vaidi. Ajay, let's take more than the 2 minutes left. You have at least 5 minutes. I'm sorry to be late in my management of time. Just interesting conversation from the chat. A colleague from Indonesia is saying we are sharing the type of challenges because of the social impacts of the lockdown, etc. We're in similar situations. So what should we do in a similar way? If you're Indonesia and India, what are the sectors where to intervene? And I think you've already answered some of the questions for India, but please don't hesitate to pick up on that question if you want.
Sebastian, let me focus on one area which has not been touched, and has not been touched by the government of India and its economic recovery packages either, and that is stimulating demand. We can have all the SMEs in the world, and they can produce stuff, but if people don't buy it, there's not much good in producing it. It just becomes a non-performing asset. So I think there is a huge place for stimulating demand. Government procurement is where it starts. And government procurement being green is, I think, the first step in moving towards both getting out of the economic downturn as well as moving towards a green recovery. Is it possible? Yes, of course it is. We made a list of the things that government procures. And it is very easy for the government to say, I would like this. Now, this also leads to a problem. And it has been talked about in policy making circles. And that is, when you provide these demand packages, you want to make sure that you are building up jobs, sustainable livelihoods, and economic growth in India. Now, this creates a problem. Will you then say no if you are getting a product from somebody else who meets the specifications? That would be WTO non-compliant. So the answer seems to be that as part of the manufacturing support that is provided, there is also an explicit thing that you will be able to compete in procurement, which would, a certain part of it would be for goods manufactured in India. That may help us move ahead. But I think a lot more thinking needs to be done on how do we create the demand so as to make the recovery buoyant. Thanks, Sebastian.
Thanks a lot, Ajay. I believe that we would now have to continue the conversation on your last point with Christophe, but we can't. I'm very sorry for that. What I want to do is just really not make words of conclusion, but really concur with the fact that we need a lot of understanding. I mean, the question from Indonesia was to me very important. The way that we also discussed about China as an investor or China as a competitor. This is, and the relationship with bilateral aid from other countries, as well as the way we can cooperate on track 2 discussions. This is really the type of thing that we need to continue having. Thank you very much, Christophe, Ajay, Vaidehi, for the time that you've given us with this seminar. We know that your time is precious, and so we really value it very much. Thank you very much for that. Thanks also to the comms team at IDRI, to Thomas Spencer, researcher at TERI, who is dear to our heart because he was formerly at IDRI, and we know that he's been instrumental in the preparation of the seminar. Pierre Barthélémy at IDRI, who also had the idea of the seminar, and Karine, who's been facilitating our technical work today. Thank you very much to you all. And the replay will be available on our website. I hope to have other opportunities to collaborate. Thank you. Hello, Thomas. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice